In this lecture, we're going to begin our discussion of chapter 12, which is skeletal muscle physiology. So, skeletal muscle gets its name, first of all, because it attaches to the skeleton. It attaches to bones. And then ultimately, what it does is it moves those bones, and thus it accomplishes human movement. That's what skeletal muscle does. That's where the definition comes from. It attaches to the skeleton and thus moves the skeleton. And what we want to try to understand is ultimately the structure of skeletal muscle, the function of skeletal muscle, and that will then allow us to see how it moves bones and moves the human body. So if you look at this image, you can kind of get an idea that what is being depicted here is the biceps muscle. Okay. Now, we're not specifically trying to focus on the biceps muscle. This is just a diagram showing ultimately the biceps muscle, but you can apply this to any skeletal muscle in the human body. This could be the deltoid, this could be one of the hamstring, quadricep, calf muscles, whatever. It could be any one of those. The point that this image is trying to make and it's trying to show is the different layers of connective tissue around any given muscle. Again, so this is the biceps muscle, but these same layers of connective tissue would exist around the deltoid, hamstring muscles, whatever. Pick any muscle in the human body, skeletal muscle in the human body, and you're going to see these same layers of connective tissue. So let's start off with the most outer layer, which is here. This is what's called the epimysium. The epimysium is a layer of connective tissue that surrounds the entire muscle. Okay, so this is the biceps muscle. The epimysium surrounds the entire biceps muscle. Okay, again, you could do this for the deltoid. If you had the deltoid, there would be an epimysium, and that would surround the entire deltoid. If you were talking about the gastroc, right, the major calf muscle, the epimysium would surround the entire gastroc. Now, if we move deeper into the muscle, we'll find out that a whole skeletal muscle, and this applies again to any whole skeletal muscle, is divided into these things called fascicles. These right here are each fascicles. You'll find this in any skeletal muscle. Internally, the whole muscle, the whole biceps muscle, the whole deltoid muscle, the whole gastroc, right? If you look inside of it, it'll be divided into these things called fascicles. Now, we'll talk about what the fascicles are in just a moment, but let's just first say the connective tissue that surrounds individual fascicles is what's called the perimysium. The perimysium is this layer of connective tissue that surrounds each individual fascicle. Each individual fascicle is surrounded by a layer of connective tissue that is referred to as the perimysium. So the entire muscle is surrounded by a layer of connective tissue called the epimysium. Internally, the whole muscle is divided into fascicles, these bundles, and each fascicle is surrounded by a layer of connective tissue called the perimysium. So what makes up a fascicle now? Okay. This is one fascicle that is being extracted out of this biceps muscle. This is the actual fascicle itself right here. Okay? And inside of each fascicle, you find actual muscle fibers, also known as muscle cells. Okay? So fascicles themselves here are made up of muscle fibers or muscle cells. You're going to find out that each muscle fiber is a cell, so you can call them either muscle fibers or muscle cells. You'll hear it said either way. Ultimately, it means the exact same thing, right? The terms are synonymous. Okay? So these individual fascicles are, what a fascicle is it's really a bundle of muscle fibers, right? Because inside of a fascicle is where you actually find the muscle fibers or the muscle cells. Now, here's the thing. You can see the fascicle right here that's being extracted out of the biceps muscle, and then you can actually see one muscle fiber or one muscle cell that is being pulled out of that fascicle. Okay? And the point I'm actually trying to get to here is that the connective tissue that surrounds each individual muscle fiber or muscle cell, and this becomes very important, is what's called the endomysium. The endomysium surrounds each individual muscle fiber, again, or muscle cell. I'm just going to say muscle fiber from now on, and please realize that you could call it muscle cell as well. Each individual muscle fiber is surrounded by a layer of connective tissue referred to as the endomysium. So now let's compartmentalize the whole muscle, and then after that, we'll focus more heavily on the structure of an individual muscle fiber. So pick any whole muscle in the human body. I don't care what it is. Now you're going to see the same layering of connective tissue. The whole muscle itself is going to be surrounded by a layer of connective tissue called the epimysium. If you go inside of the whole muscle, you're going to find that the whole muscle is divided into fascicles, which are really bundles of muscle fibers. Each fascicle is surrounded by a layer of connective tissue called the perimysium. Great. Now, if you were to look inside of a fascicle, you would see that a fascicle is made up of a whole bunch of muscle fibers. Okay? So you can see one fascicle being pulled out here, and then one muscle fiber being pulled out of the fascicle. And what we know about the individual muscle fibers themselves is that they are surrounded by a layer of connective tissue known as the endomysium. The endomysium is the connective tissue that surrounds the individual muscle fibers themselves. That's how you compartmentalize a whole muscle, like a biceps muscle. One thing, please realize this is by no means drawn to scale. Okay, the biceps muscle has somewhere between like 200,000 and 400,000 muscle fibers, and it is a relatively small muscle compared to other muscles that you have in the human body, which can have millions of muscle fibers inside of them. Okay, so that's something that is important to recognize. Muscle fibers themselves are very microscopic, right? They're very, very small. You can tweeze them out using some special machinery, but they're very, very small. Right? There's a lot of muscle fibers within any given muscle in the human body, even if it's relatively small. Skeletal muscle, I mean. Within any given skeletal muscle, you're going to find lots of individual muscle fibers within it. Now we need to talk about what's the purpose of all these layers of connective tissue. Why do you need the whole muscle to be surrounded by the epimysium, the fascicles to be surrounded by the perimysium, and the muscle fibers to be surrounded by the endomysium? What's the relevance of all this? The answer is that there's a huge relevance to all these layers of connective tissue. And what is that? Like, what is it? To answer that question, you need to know a little bit about skeletal muscle fibers, but nothing that you can't understand right now. Okay, so individual muscle fibers, what they do is contract. The muscle fibers, the individual muscle fibers themselves inside of the fascicles, those are the actual structures inside of a whole muscle that actually contract and produce force. Now the major point of this lecture and future lectures is to understand how individual muscle fibers do this. That's really how you understand. I mean, that is skeletal muscle physiology. It's understanding how individual muscle fibers actually contract and thus produce force. But we're not at that point, and I don't think we need to be at that point to just simply understand individual muscle fibers have the ability to contract and produce force, which is very important to the point of the fact that all of these layers of connective tissue are continuous. And let me explain what that means. So the epimysium, the perimysium, right, all of these different perimysii, and the endomysium, right, all these different endomysium, they all merge together at the end of the muscle. Okay, the epimysium, the perimysium, and the endomysium all merge together. And they merge together at the end of the muscle to form what we call the muscle tendon. And there's a tendon on each end of the muscle. Okay. So the tendon is actually formed. There might be slight differences between, you know, the anatomy of a tendon versus these different layers of connective tissue, but ultimately they're completely continuous with each other. And it's simple enough to realize that the epimysium, all the layers of perimysii, all the different layers of the endomysium, they all merge together at the end, at each end of the muscle and form a tendon. So each whole muscle, like the biceps muscle, is going to have a tendon on each end. Okay? And it's really ultimately going to be formed by all these different layers of connective tissue merging together. And we don't need to go through the whole anatomy of the biceps muscle, but let's just look at it at least in a diagram with regard to these tendons. Every whole muscle, right? Every whole skeletal muscle, there's actually a few exceptions to this rule, but generally speaking, every whole skeletal muscle is going to have two tendons, right? There's a tendon on each end. Okay? One tendon is going to attach to one bone, and the other tendon is going to attach to a completely different bone. Okay? That's true of most skeletal muscles. One tendon attaches to a specific bone, and then the other tendon attaches to an entirely different bone. They're going to be relatively close together, typically the two bones in proximity, not always, but usually. And ultimately, what this organization allows for is something very important. Let's relate this to the biceps muscle. So the biceps muscle has one tendon. It's two different heads, but they both ultimately attach to different locations of the scapula. Okay, one tendon of the biceps muscle attaches to the scapula, and the other tendon attaches to the radius. This is not anatomy, so we don't need to know specific locations. So here's the organization that you've got. The biceps muscle is organized so that one tendon attaches to the scapula and the other tendon attaches to the radius. And we also have to realize, very important, that the different tendons on each end are formed from these different layers of connective tissue, the epimysium, the perimysium, and the endomysium, all merging together at the end of the muscle. And now we get back to that point that I was saying, which is you don't need to understand this fully to just make the simple point that or have the simple understanding that skeletal muscle fibers, these individual muscle fibers, they contract and generate force. Now, how does the individual muscle fibers contracting and generating force relate to the fact that all these layers of connective tissue merge together at the end of the muscle and form tendons, and the tendons attach to different bones? So to begin that answer, we know that these individual muscle fibers can contract and generate force. We'll get to all that as the lecture progresses. Okay, the individual muscle fibers contract and they generate force, and they are surrounded by a layer of connective tissue called the endomysium. Now, when these individual muscle fibers contract and they generate force, we'll get to this, how this happens later on in the lectures too, but when they contract and they generate force, they relay that force to the connective tissue that surrounds them, which is the endomysium, right? If the muscle fibers generate force, that's a totally meaningless thing unless the force is relayed on to something, right? Otherwise, what would be the purpose of muscle fibers generating force at all? Sometimes it might be for the production of heat to keep the human body warm with like shivering, but generally speaking, that force that's generated by the individual muscle fibers, it needs to be relayed onto something to serve a purpose. And ultimately, the force that's generated by all the different hundreds of thousands of muscle fibers in the biceps muscle, the force that they generate, it's relayed onto the connective tissue that surrounds them that we call the endomysium. And now here's the thing. What is the endomysium continuous with? Well, all of the different endomysium merge with the perimysium, merge with the epimysium to form the tendons on each end. So the point is, if an individual muscle fiber relays force onto the endomysium that surrounds it, right? This is a terrible depiction here, okay? If this individual muscle fiber relays force onto the endomysium that surrounds it, which would really be like right here, right? It's not, the endomysium isn't actually depicted around this muscle fiber, but you can imagine it being around the muscle fiber, okay? So that individual muscle fiber contracts and it generates force, and it relays that force onto the endomysium that surrounds it, okay? That endomysium ultimately is continuous with all these other layers of connective tissue and ultimately the tendon. So where does the force ultimately get relayed onto that the muscle fiber generates? The answer is onto the tendon. Because if the muscle fiber contracts and it relays the force onto the endomysium, and at the end of the muscle, the endomysium is continuous with the tendon, then individual muscle fibers relaying force onto the endomysium ultimately translates into that force being relayed onto the muscle tendons, because that's what the endomysii are continuous with. And then you have to ask yourself a final question, which is, what are the tendons attached to? The tendons are attached to bones. And this is where it all comes together, right? The individual muscle fiber is going to contract, it's going to generate force, and it's going to relay that force onto the connective tissue that surrounds it, known as the endomysium. If the muscle fiber relays that force onto the connective tissue, the endomysium that surrounds it, and the endomysium is continuous with all these other layers of connective tissue and ultimately forms the tendon, then relaying the force onto the a little bit of a technical delay here. If the individual muscle fiber contracts, then it will relay ultimately that force onto the endomysium, which will result in that force being relayed ultimately downstream onto the tendon. And from the tendon, this is the important part, the force will be relayed onto the bone. So individual muscle fibers, when they contract, if you really want to think about it this way, the force that they generate gets relayed onto the bones of our body. That is the overarching point of all this. Now, there's a multi-step process by which that force is generated and by which that force ultimately gets relayed onto the bones. But when muscle fibers in a skeletal muscle contract, the force that they generate gets relayed onto the bones of our body, and it causes our bones, our joints, to move. So let's think specifically about the biceps muscle. So to figure out what any given muscle is going to do, you have to look at its two tendons, right? There's a tendon on each end. One tendon attaches to one bone and the other tendon attaches to the other bone. Now, this is not anatomy, so I'm trying to be conscious of the fact that I can't spend too much time on all this, but due to biomechanical reasons, the two bones that the two tendons attach to, right? One tendon attaches to one bone, the other tendon attaches to another bone. One of those bones will move and the other bone won't move, okay? So what you end up with is something called an origin and an insertion, okay? The tendon that attaches to the bone that doesn't move is called the origin. Now, you could think of the origin as just being the bone that doesn't move, but ultimately the origin is going to be the tendon that attaches to the bone that doesn't move. In this case, with the biceps muscle, that's the scapula. The insertion, on the other hand, is the tendon that attaches to the bone that does move. Okay? We'll explain all this in a second. Okay? The insertion, again, you can think about it as the bone that does move. When the muscle contracts, okay, the muscle has a tendon on each end. There's a tendon that attaches to a bone that doesn't move, called the origin, and there's a tendon that attaches to the bone that does move, which is referred to as the insertion. Now, the biceps is not any different than the vast majority of other skeletal muscles in the human body. The biceps muscle has a tendon on each end. Okay? The tendon is going to attach to one bone that doesn't move, called the origin. In the case of the biceps muscle, that's the scapula. Okay? The scapula is the origin. Okay? And then the biceps muscle is going to have a tendon that attaches to a bone that does move, that's referred to as the insertion, and that is the radius. Okay? So we don't need to know the specific parts of the scapula and the radius to figure out what the biceps muscle is going to do. So the biceps muscle has a tendon on each end. One tendon attaches to a bone that doesn't move, called the origin. In this case, that's the scapula. And one tendon attaches to a bone that does move. The insertion, in this case, in this case, that is the radius. So now, let's think about what's going to happen when the biceps muscle contracts. When the biceps muscle contracts, what really happens is the muscle fibers within the biceps muscle contract and they generate force. Okay? And what those muscle fibers do, they contract, they generate force, they relay that force onto the layers of connective tissue that surround them, called the endomysium. Okay? And at the end of the muscle, the endomysium are continuous, right, with the tendons. So if the individual muscle fibers relay their force onto the endomysium, then really what they're doing is they're relaying their force onto the tendons. And where are the tendons relaying that force onto? The bones. But now we know there's one bone that's going to move, and called the insertion, and another bone that isn't going to move, called the origin. So let's figure out what the biceps muscle is going to do. So here I've got my biceps muscle. Okay? I know my biceps muscle has two tendons. One of the tendons attaches to my scapula. That is going to be the bone that doesn't move, that we call the origin. I know my other biceps muscle tendon attaches to my radius. The radius is going to be the bone that does move. That's the insertion. Okay, so now what happens? When my biceps muscle contracts, what that really is the muscle fibers within my biceps muscle contracting. They're generating force. They're relaying that force onto the endomysium, which is relaying that force ultimately onto the tendons. And then what's going to happen is that force is relayed from the tendons onto the bones. And as that force is relayed from the tendons onto the bones, what's going to happen is the insertion, the bone that does move, is going to move towards the origin, the bone that doesn't move. Okay? So what that really means in the case of the biceps muscle is when the biceps muscle contracts, it relays force both onto the radius, the insertion, and onto the scapula, the origin. But the insertion, the radius, is going to move towards the origin, the scapula, when the contraction happens. And if the radius moves towards the scapula, what that translates into is elbow flexion, right? That's what's going to happen here, right? The radius is going to be pulled, the radius, the movable bone, the insertion, is going to be pulled towards the scapula, the origin, the non-movable bone, and we're going to produce elbow flexion. Okay? You can figure this out for every single muscle every single skeletal muscle in the entire human body. Again, there are a few exceptions to this rule, but this rule applies to really all of them. You figure out a muscle, you know that the muscle has two tendons, you know that each tendon is going to attach to a specific bone, one of them being an origin, a bone that doesn't move, and the other one being an insertion, a bone that does move. And what you'll find out is that the insertion will move towards the origin, and then you can figure out the joint action that specific muscle produces. So that concludes the introductory component to talking about skeletal muscle. Okay. I just wanted you to, see how a whole skeletal muscle is compartmentalized, and how through that compartmentalization, the actual whole muscle kind of functions on a gross level, right? The purpose of a whole skeletal muscle is to generate force and relay that force onto a tendon and onto a bone, and thus move a bone towards another bone and generate, human movement of the skeleton. And now what we're going to do, now that we've done that, is we're going to really focus in on the cellular level, right? We're going to focus in on these individual muscle fibers or these muscle cells. We're going to look at their structure, and through their structure, how they actually function to generate force. And hopefully, as we go through this on a cellular level as to how individual muscle fibers generate force, you can take that information and you can extrapolate it, to the bigger concept, which is what that force that's being generated by these individual fibers is actually doing. Right? The force is being generated by the fibers ultimately to move the bones of the body. So that's kind of what we'll move into in the next lecture is emphasizing these individual muscle fibers and how they function.